Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Thank you particularly for coming at short notice, as I always like to quote on these great occasions, and since this is the anniversary of D-Day, Stalin, who said, in the matter of arms production, eventually enough quantity becomes quality. And we have both quantity and quality here today. In terms of our audience, you've come at short notice, and in terms of our keynote speaker and our distinguished panelists. We're honoured to be able to welcome them all. We're also delighted to be able to announce a new programme of work, and this will inform our thinking and our approach to policy matters in the years to come. Today's event is therefore part of a concerted effort by Policy Exchange to chart an ambitious vision for the future of the United Kingdom, a reimagined role for the nation state, and towards a new national consensus. British politics today is in stalemate. No one has an overall majority, and contrary to what we've been led to believe, no one side has momentum. This was the only lesson to be drawn from last month's rather inconclusive local election results, and it's confirmed by the polling figures which show both major parties hovering at about the 40% mark. There is therefore little margin for error. And it would be, at the same time, it would be wrong to say that this comes from the things that people have thought to be wrong about our politics for many years: disillusionment or boredom with the alternatives on offer. The EU referendum saw a higher turnout than for any national vote in 20 years. In fact, whatever one's view of it, more people voted for Brexit than they voted for anything in the history of this country. On the one side, then, there is a party political deadlock and stasis, which is complicated even further by divisions over Brexit. On the other side, clearly, immense popular engagement with politics and a huge appetite for change. Neither of these sit easily with each other, an irresistible force and an immovable object. The danger, therefore, which not only faces the think tank community, but the entire political class, is to become consumed with trench warfare. In the last 3 years, we've seen the EU referendum sandwiched between two general elections, and we live under the constant shadow of another. That's why we're delighted to be able to host the Secretary of State for Environment today for what I think, and I can say this without exaggeration, will be one of the boldest and most substantive speeches on policy made by a government minister for some time, on reforming capitalism for the 21st century. It's also why we're delighted to have the wide range of views today on our panel from different political parties and different wider policy perspectives. Such initiatives cannot be the venture of any one party or faction. That is not how we see a new national consensus will be forged. It is that same spirit which actuates the new programme of work which we are putting forward here at Policy Exchange. We believe that think tanks can and should do more than get sucked into daily trench warfare, act like focus groups, engage in policy consumerism, and provide polyfiller for future manifestos. Now, more than ever, we see that there is a golden opportunity for creative radicalism. This does not mean engaging in policy soundbites, but in wrestling with first-order questions about the shape and structure of our polity and economy, the role of the state in society, national and regional identity, and our place in the world. To adapt a phrase from William Beveridge, a revolutionary moment in our nation's history is a time for revolutions, not patching. But successful revolutions are brought about by the building of a consensus. They require more than simply peeling off segments of the electorate, whether students, pensioners, aspirant house owners, or public sector workers, in the hope then of subsequently cobbling together a majority or collapsing over the line, having run alongside one's rival. It is our view at Policy Exchange that the divisions over Brexit and the last two general elections obscure a deeper truth, that there are grounds for building a new national consensus. This simply can't be a reheated or a regurgitated version of the past attempts to forge such consensus, or the return of so-called centrists. It has to be bolder and more ambitious than that. Secretary of State's remarks today are very much in this spirit. They reach far across the aisle without resorting to the themes and memes of a hollowed-out centre ground. They are also a spur for us at Policy Exchange in launching our own new programme of work, in seeking to build this new national consensus. This work will fall under four categories, 4 themes, 4 Ps, which we consider to be the necessary pillars for a new national consensus: prosperity, people, place, and patriotism. You will be hearing more from us about these in the coming weeks, but we will begin today by focusing on one of those P's, prosperity, on which all others depend, and the title of our keynote is addressed, The Right Environment for Growth, Reforming Capitalism for the 21st Century. Michael, thank you for honouring us with your presence. We look forward to hearing what you and the other panellists have to say.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to Dean for that very generous introduction, and to you all for coming along this morning. And it's a particular pleasure to be here at Policy Exchange. I was part of the team that helped create Policy Exchange more than a decade ago. And since then, and under the leadership of inspired directors, not least Dean, Policy Exchange has established itself as Britain's leading think tank. And it's done so much to anticipate and to meet the challenges of our times. And it's in the spirit of modernisation that Policy Exchange is modernising itself under Dean's leadership, with the focus on the 4 new areas that he's identified. And talking to Dean about the work that he and the team here wanted to undertake in each of those areas, I offered to share just a few thoughts to help drive the policy redevelopment programme which this think tank, which I admire so much, is undertaking. And I think it's only fair to acknowledge that actually, since its launch, Policy Exchange has consistently identified the essential challenges that modern governments have to face. And in particular, Policy Exchange has identified the specific challenges that Britain's leaders have had to face to modernise government. And the issues that Policy Exchange has focused on from the start, for example, how to close the gap and raise the bar in state education, how to make administrative power accountable, how to unite the communities of these islands with a shared civic identity, these are as relevant today as they were when Policy Exchange was launched. And Policy Exchange's recent work on housing in London is now pointing the way to solving one of our most pressing political issues. And Policy Exchange has been characterised by coming up with practical solutions to the policies that government has to have at the heart of its agenda. Take just one area which is very close to my heart: education. It was here, at Policy Exchange, that the principle of greater choice, innovation and diversity in English education as a route to higher standards was really developed. And it was here at Policy Exchange, true to your modernising mission, that the aim of those policies was directed at helping the poorest students most. Policy Exchange championed the spread of academy freedoms across all schools. Policy Exchange developed the idea of the free school as a challenger and innovator in state education. And also here, the pupil premium was designed to ensure the delivery of enhanced funding for the poorest students in state education. And thanks to those reforms, we now have 1.9 million more children in schools ranked good or outstanding by Ofsted. The attainment gap between rich and poor in state schools has closed, so advancing greater equality of opportunity, and new free schools have been routes to success for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, hitherto denied access to educational excellence. There are now 391 free schools open and a further 300 on the way. When fully up and running, they'll provide 400,000 new school places, places which would not have existed without Policy Exchange's pioneering work. And free schools aren't only popular with parents, with secondary free schools receiving 4 applications for every place. They're providing some of the best education available in England today. Nearly 1 in 3 free schools are rated outstanding by Ofsted, compared to 1 in 5 schools overall. The undeniable success of the free school programme is a powerful reminder, not just of the influence and impact of Policy Exchange's ideas, but also of deeper truths. Competition and innovation drive up standards for all, but they most benefit the outsiders and the excluded, who are discriminated against by those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. And also, the inheritance that we enjoy as a result of past human endeavour, the knowledge gained and the investments made, are there to benefit us all. We must ensure that whether it is the best that's been thought and written, the moral principles of the good life, or an appreciation of beauty and balance in our created and natural environment, that we pass on to the next generation their inheritance, not just protected, but enhanced. And it's with those principles in mind that I want to turn to one of the greatest challenges of our times, a challenge which Policy Exchange, as Dean has explained, has set itself to meet and master with new programmes of work, and a challenge that the Prime Minister has identified as essential to our mission in government. And that challenge is the failure of our current model of capitalism to deliver the progress that we all aspire to. to deliver a country and an economy and a capitalism that works for everyone. It's imperative that we address current failures honestly and unsparingly, determined to identify where and how we've gone wrong, because unless we rescue and reinvigorate capitalism, then we will find the engine which has generated so much of mankind's progress either stalls or moves into reverse. Capitalism, free markets, free enterprise, the freedom to invest, buy, sell, organise, innovate, choose and decide, has been the single most liberating force in our history. It's raised billions out of poverty, brought food, water, heat and shelter, entertainment and enlightenment, the space to appreciate beauty and the time to cultivate relationships to peoples and nations which hitherto struggled simply to survive. Capitalism, or free enterprise, is not a simple matter of economics, though the wrong economic ideas can be very harmful, nor is it a specific set of institutions, though the right institutions help societies to flourish. It's not a product of banks, we've had them for centuries, or markets, which are embedded in human nature and arise spontaneously whenever humans congregate. Nor is it the product of any specific technological breakthrough, because technology's ability to change society always depends on human choice. No, capitalism, or more specifically, the enormous growth in human productivity that it has generated, arose in the very specific circumstances of the 16th and 17th centuries in Atlantic nations. In the Dutch Republic, the British Isles, and then the United States, a set of ideas captured society, a mindset developed, a world outlook took hold, which was uniquely equipped to accelerate mankind's progress as never before. If we look at human productivity for millennia over history, it appears more or less to flatline. Through empires and barbarian uprisings, whether Caesar rules or Charlemagne, the productivity of our societies remained remarkably static. Then, whoosh, it rocketed skywards. First, in that corner of northwestern Europe, then across the Atlantic. As a result of an intellectual revolution, the shape of human growth becomes like a hockey stick. And the nature of that human revolution? Well, it's been best described and defined by the historians of ideas, Deirdre McCluskey and Joel Mokyr, who have explained how a set of ideas and principles came together in a new creative ferment. The Dutch Republic finally extricated itself from the continental Habsburg Empire in the early 17th century and established an alternative to the hierarchical, authoritarian and restrictive imperial regime under which its people had been held back. Free inquiry and free speech were celebrated rather than being subject to the constraints of the Inquisition. Respect was accorded to merchants and maritime entrepreneurs on the basis of merit earned, rather than being demanded by aristocrats on the basis of rank inherited. The awkward, the dissident, and the heretical who stood against Habsburg power and had faced persecution were welcomed, and they brought challenge, innovation, and progress to the infant republic. And Britain, first under the Tudor modernization of medieval institutions, and then with gathering pace in the 17th century, especially after 1688, followed an allied trajectory. Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers, such as Mandeville, Locke, and then Adam Smith, actively celebrated free exchange and free thinking, and they challenged protectionism, mercantilism, and hierarchy. The innovator, whether in commerce, science, or politics, was celebrated, and entrenched authority questioned. If the spirit of the age had an essence, it was in the motto of the Royal Society, itself created in 1663. The world's premier scientific association took as its watchword nullius in verba, loosely translated as take nobody's word for it. In other words, challenge authority, question the incumbents, test and experiment, disrupt and innovate. It was that spirit, restless, questioning, creative, and committed to extending both the sum of human knowledge and the scope for humanity to flourish, which generated the amazing economic growth for which the capitalist system is rightly lauded. And in thinking of that spirit and of science, it's important also to remember that capitalism generated the wealth which allowed a flourishing of interest and discovery in the natural sciences. Without the economic growth that capitalism secured, we would not have benefited from the work of Darwin or Audubon, Attenborough or Wilson, and we would not now have that deeper understanding of the world around us and our place within it, which is the foundation of environmental activism. But while capitalism has brought both growth and progress in so many fields in the past, I fear it's not delivering now. As our Prime Minister put it, Our economy should work for everyone. But if your pay's stagnated for several years in a row and fixed items of spending keep going up, it doesn't feel like it's working for you. Now, the problems we face are not unprecedented. There have, of course, been moments in our past when capitalism foundered, when free markets appeared to fail. In the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 70s, there were similar, although not identical moments, when we needed to reform capitalism to save it. On each of those occasions, either the tendency of markets towards monopoly, or an over-reliance on debt, or a failure to celebrate the innovator and the disruptor, or a moral failure to insist on proper respect for those excluded, exploited, and marginalised by the prevailing social and economic order, contributed to stagnation and to political crisis. What makes our time at least as challenging as any one of those individual periods is that all of those forces and phenomena are present now. Economic power has been concentrated in the hands of a few, and crony capitalists have rigged the system in their favour and against the rest of us. Over recent decades, debt has fueled growth in an unsustainable fashion. Indeed, growth has been built not just on irresponsible levels of borrowing, but an unsustainable approach towards natural resources as well. Our politics, culture, and regulatory models have also worked against innovation. Indeed, have been actively pushed in that direction by powerful incumbents. Many of our fellow citizens, especially those without the qualifications and connections to work the existing system, have seen less and less value placed on their work and on themselves. And at the same time, communities and individuals have seen so much of what they value which is beyond economics, whether that's their love of place and landscape, or the integrity of the close relationships and cultural attachments which they value so much, overlooked and ignored. But some would argue, well, what's the evidence for the problem we face? Not just in the UK, but in the economies that you talk about across the globe. Well, overall, growth and its principal driver, human productivity, have been and are on declining trends across the developed world. True, there are cyclical upticks and downturns in specific regions and economies at specific times, but the overall direction has been downwards. Between 1950 and 1973, average growth of real GDP per capita in Western economies was around 4%. Between 1973 and 2007, however, this fell to less than 2%. And of course, in most advanced economies, GDP shrank further in the aftermath of the 2008 crash. Few now predict a return to anything like the growth rates of the 50s and 60s, or even the 80s. Productivity figures are similarly sobering. Total factor productivity growth has been declining across developed nations. The growth and productivity of labour in the most advanced economies, those of the G7, was 1.2% lower between 1995 and 2012 than between 1970 and 1980. Between 1995 and 2009, labour productivity in European nations rose by just 1% annually. And since 2008, the outlook has grown darker for most, with productivity stalling, so unemployment has increased in many advanced economies, particularly amongst the young and, of course, those with fewer skills. Wage growth has stagnated, and expectations of future security have eroded as occupational pension schemes have been plundered or have dissipated in value. And these unfortunate trends have gone hand in hand with an increased concentration of wealth and power in the hands of those who are already wealthy and powerful. It's not just that members of the cognitive elite, the well-educated and well-connected, have the networks and the mobility to insulate themselves from economic shocks. It's also the case that deliberate policy decisions have rewarded those who are already asset-rich. Loose money policies from the European Central Bank to the US Federal Reserve have increased the price of assets from real estate to equities, strengthening the economic position of the already wealthy. That's why I firmly believe the Prime Minister was so right to call out what she described as the bad side effects of these practices. As she pointed out, people with assets have got richer. People without them have suffered. So, with growth overall slower and productivity sluggish, there is less new wealth to go around every year. And with the poor more and more shut out from what growth there may be while the rich grow richer, then it's unsurprising that there should be political consequences. Which is why, across the developed world since 2008, we've seen such remarkable political upheaval. It's understandable that commentators should focus on the election of President Trump or the Brexit vote in Britain as significant political moments. But it's impossible to understand either, I would argue, without situating them in the broader wave of political change which has swept across the West. Political parties on the social democratic left, who've seen it as their job to manage economies so as to generate and then redistribute the fruits of economic growth, have suffered reverse after reverse. Whether it's PASOK in Greece or the SPD in Germany, the Socialists in France or Labour in the Netherlands, these parties have been in decline. In their place have grown radical movements of the left, whether it's Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Die Linke in Germany, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise. And this malaise has not only affected the social democratic left. There's been a reckoning. There we are. There's been a reckoning for the established parties of the centre-right, which were in power during or immediately after the events leading up to or around 2008. Whether it's been Civic Platform in Poland or the Republicans in France, Berlusconi's Conservatives in Italy or New Democracy in Greece, establishment right parties have seen their support fracture, and increasingly votes have gone to identitarian or anti-liberal parties of the right, whether that's the Front National, the Alternative für Deutschland, or others. Now, of course, there have been exceptions. In France, Emmanuel Macron's phenomenally successful campaign proved that even under intense attack, the centre can hold. And in Britain, a moderate centre-right government significantly increased its share of the vote at the expense of the narrow identity politics of UKIP. But it's important to see those results in context. In the first round of the presidential election, Emmanuel Macron secured just 24%, albeit, of course, from a standing start. And parties of the established left, right and centre won only around 50% of the total votes cast. Fully half of France voted for radical or extreme left and right movements. And in Britain, while the Conservatives secured the highest share of the vote since Margaret Thatcher's election in 1987, that was against a Labour Party which, while nominally still the movement of Attlee, Wilson, Callaghan and Brown, is in fact now really a movement of the radical left, more in tune with Syriza, Podemos and La France Insoumise than any traditional centre-left social democratic party. Now, these political currents pose a particular danger for the free market system which has generated so much wealth and opportunity in the past, and which I believe has the potential to do so again. The current failure of capitalism to deliver prosperity and opportunity, as it has, can and should, has fed the revival of ideological movements which threatened and indeed harmed free markets and human flourishing in the past. In 1890s America, the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few led to a growth in populism, championed at that time with beguiling elegance by the Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who spoke up for those excluded from the benefits of growth. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. You shall not press down a crown of thorns on the brow of labour, he demanded. And in similar vein, across Europe, socialist and Marxist movements grew in power in the face of inequality and injustice, while demands for tariff wars and protectionist movements also grew in force. Joseph Chamberlain was the most eloquent advocate of protection in the UK, arguing for tariffs both as a means of raising revenue for the poor and as a shield against the wrenching change imposed by competition. Again, in the 1930s, amid the pain of the Great Depression, protectionism enjoyed a new lease of life with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act enacted by the US Congress. Populist economic solutions attracted millions, while the openness to experimentation, change and progress which characterized capitalism in its infancy and at its best were apparently everywhere in retreat. But in both periods, capitalism, when it was reformed, recovered. In America, at the beginning of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt attacked monopoly power and reinvigorated the free enterprise system by redistributing opportunity. His political movement, progressivism, saw off the populist challenge. Just as the Liberal government of 1906, the government of both Churchill and Lloyd George held back both protectionist and socialist forces with programs of free trade, domestic reform, and social justice. And again in the 1930s, another Roosevelt, Franklin, reformed capitalism to save it with the New Deal. And the national government here, with the support of moderate Labour and free trade liberal elements in its leadership, learned from the Tory mistakes of the 20s. The Conservative flirtation with protectionism and the embrace of the gold standard had aligned the party with the interests of the established rather than the aspirations of the whole nation. But liberal economic policies and investment in social reform helped insulate much of 30s Britain from forces that capsized free markets and free societies elsewhere. Because there is always the need for reform. And as the Prime Minister has said, supporting free markets means stepping in to repair them when they aren't working as they should. Conservatives, she's rightly pointed out, have always understood that if you want to preserve something important, you need to be prepared to reform it. We must apply that same approach today. So, with capitalism failing to deliver now, as it has failed for periods in the past, with free markets in the past having been threatened by protectionism and populism, but having been rescued by reform, then we need to contemplate reform now. But what type of reform is needed, or even possible now? Well, I think reform must begin with an acknowledgement of the scale and nature of our problem. At the heart of our challenge is the failure to generate truly sustainable levels of growth. And behind that failure lies our inability, as I've mentioned, over many years, to increase productivity. And one of the most important ways, I think, in which we can address our productivity problem, improve growth, and ensure that growth is truly sustainable, is by thinking more deeply and holistically about productivity, and in the process, perhaps redefining how we approach capitalism. The traditional factors of productivity, as defined by economists, have been land, labour, and capital, or as you and I might think of them, nature, humanity, and money. Increased productivity in the past has been defined as the more successful exploitation of land, the more imaginative deployment of labour, and the more prudent allocation of capital so as to generate growth. Well, I think if we're to improve productivity in the future and also secure enduring support for capitalism, we should think of land not as a factor to be exploited, but instead we should be thinking of nature as a resource to be nurtured and renewed. We should be thinking of labour not as a commodity to be directed and deployed. We should be thinking of humanity as a resource that we should invest in and cherish. And we should think of capital not in terms of the return it immediately earns, but the innovation and the progress that it ultimately generates. A capitalism based on investment in our natural capital and our human capital, and on using financial capital to invest in innovation, not secure reward for rentiers, can both generate increased productivity in our economy and also, I believe, greater justice in our society. How should it work? We'll look first of all at our current problem with the allocation of financial capital. Over recent years, innovation has declined and growth has stalled because capital has not been allocated to productive investment. In advanced Western economies, business investment as a proportion of GDP has been falling since the 70s. Moreover, according to the Swedish economists Fredrik Eriksson and Bjorn Weigel, to whom I'm indebted for so much of this analysis, the trend rate of investment growth in research and development in the US is declining, and similarly, R&D expenditure as a percentage of net sales has been stagnant as well. So where's the money going? Well, in crude terms, it's gone to those who've been interested in extracting a rent for now, not reinvesting for the future. It's gone into dividends for those who already have shares, share buyback schemes, which allow managers and executives to enrich themselves in the short term at the expense of future investment, mergers and acquisition activity, which closes down competition instead of funding innovation, which generates competition. It's gone into payments for executives who are rewarded for risk-averse bureaucratic managerialism rather than creativity and judicious risk-taking. Major institutional investors as well, including sovereign wealth funds, have been risk-averse and indeed susceptible to political influence in how they allocate funds, influence which rarely encourages support for the innovative or the disruptive. And the structure of many modern companies, with ownership spread across multiple institutions and investors, responsibility for decision-making diffuse and accountability opaque, tends to deter the innovative and creative activity which marks out the genuinely wealth-creating entrepreneurs. And in my own department, I've seen this happen in the water sector, and that's why I'm working with the regulator Ofwat to ensure that water companies must change, or change will come to them. Across the developed world, the rentier model of capitalism, which gives rewards to incumbents, insulates existing managers from challenge, and reinforces the relative wealth of the already wealthy, has proven bad for economic growth and inimical to social justice. And it also, unfortunately, coexists with a tendency towards crony capitalism. Established economic interests have the time, the money, and the personnel to get close to government, which disruptors, innovators, and startups do not. And they use those connections and that cash to defend their position against competition. The Prime Minister's identified the culprits: bosses who earn a fortune but don't look after their staff, international companies that treat tax laws as an optional extra, directors who take out massive dividends while knowing that the company pension is about to go bust. And regulation, which is of course vital to the safe operation of markets and trust in society overall, is often captured by incumbents and then fashioned to serve their interests. Instead of strong, transparent, and effective regulation, which delineates clearly what's permitted and what's forbidden, we get opaque, cumbersome, and multi-layered rules, which are lobbied for and then adopted by existing players, the better in their eyes to deter competition and to secure their existing market share. And in a low-growth world, defending existing market share becomes more important than ever. And so control of the rules of the game becomes more lucrative than ever. So established companies with cash in the bank make sure to spend a generous slug on lobbying and securing rules that favour their interests, which is why the two cities with the fastest income growth per capita in their respective nations and regions are Washington, D.C. and Brussels, where so much is being spent on securing the right lobbying outcomes. In 2016, lobbyists spent a record 1.7 billion euros persuading officials in Brussels to shape regulation in their favour. So what can be done? How can we restore incentives to innovation, creativity and growth? How do we create, as the Prime Minister has argued for, a capitalism that works for everyone? Well, as the Chancellor has powerfully argued, what we need to think about is investing today for the economy of tomorrow. So we should build on the excellent work on corporate governance reform begun by Greg Clark and look at the incentives which exist to reward rentiers and to promote schemes like share buybacks rather than encourage productive investment. We need to call out and hold to account those bosses, the unacceptable faces of capitalism in the Prime Minister's phrase, who do award themselves excessive pay rises. And we can consider how the rules which guide and govern how investors are incentivised to allocate capital could be reformed to promote investment in new ventures and equity stakes in innovation, rather than taking low-risk short-term options, such as simply rewarding incumbents and buying sovereign debt. We can look again at the tax treatment of different types of investment, see how it could change, and how we could develop smarter regulation outside the strictures of EU membership. And we can think about how we structure corporate ownership to encourage entrepreneurialism. Is the traditional dislike in this country of different classes of share still justified when precisely that model has helped the founders of American tech companies keep control and maintain an innovative outlook even as their companies have grown? We can also consider how we could reform government procurement rules outside the EU to encourage innovation, and indeed reform regulation to make it more effective, transparent and direct, giving new businesses a more predictable background against which to grow. And we can also think about how we ensure capital is invested or reinvested in those communities outside the southeast and London who've been denied access to capital in the past. And we can also, in particular, think about placing appropriate restrictions or controls on lobbying and associated expenditure to prevent the powerful rigging markets in their favour. Now, these suggestions are not meant to be either authoritative or exhaustive. They're simply potential lines of inquiry for policy exchange to develop in its work. Now, I cannot predict how this work of intellectual endeavour on policy exchange's part will develop, but I do know that with our capitalist system in need of significant reform and the rentier approach in need of sustained challenge, this work is both urgent and important. And there's another reason why this work is of such importance. Debt. Economic growth over recent decades has been fuelled by a level of borrowing which is unsustainable. Nations from the US to Greece, Belgium to Italy have debt to GDP ratios of more than 100%, and levels of private and corporate debt across the West are similarly high and equally unsustainable in the long term. Given how deeply we've exhausted debt as a fuel for growth, it's clear that growth in the future will have to come from innovation and creativity, rather than simply more of the same. And that takes me to natural capital and our relationship with nature. Just as growth over recent decades has been underpinned by an unsustainable reliance on debt, so growth over many decades has been driven by an unsustainable approach towards the natural world. We know that natural resources, in almost every case, are finite, but our approach to them has not always been marked by the prudence and restraint that such knowledge should inspire. We have extracted, exploited, and then discarded in a way which implied we thought there was no penalty to pay for living for the day, rather than thinking of tomorrow. And just as executives who benefit from share buybacks are extracting value now at the expense of investment for the future, and economies boosted by debt are enjoying a temporary boost, which future generations will have to pay more for, so a reckless approach towards natural capital privileges immediate gratification over handing on our world in a healthier state to the next generation. The capitalism that we should champion for the future should place the importance of protecting, enhancing, and growing natural capital at its heart. Instead of treating rivers and oceans as dumping grounds for chemicals and plastics, treating forest cover as an impediment to bringing land under cultivation, regarding soil as a resource to be sweated and chemically engineered, and the natural world as one vast coal scuttle and larder to be raided at will, we should instead be investing in cleaner drinking water for a growing population, oceans free of plastic in which fish can flourish, increased tree cover so carbon dioxide can be absorbed from the atmosphere and wildlife can flourish, and also soil, which has the enriched organic content that will sustain life and growth for generations to come. Instead of a linear model for the economy in which we extract resources carelessly, use them extravagantly, and then generate waste which further harms our planet and fouls our own nest, we should move increasingly to a circular economy, where we reduce our reliance on virgin materials, reuse and recycle wherever possible, and recognise that there is no elsewhere where we can deposit waste material. Only one world, which we have a duty to hand on to our children in a better state than we found it. And that also means safeguarding biodiversity, not just because of the intrinsic worth and beauty of the natural world, but also because our resilience to future shocks and challenges depends on the wealth and breadth of microbial, plant, and animal life around us. In order to ensure that we properly value and benefit from the growth of natural capital, we need to develop our economic models to marry the innovation that only the market can provide to the moral purpose of environmental enhancement. The work on natural capital accounting pioneered by Professor Dieter Helm, and increasingly adopted by more and more businesses, helps us all to better price in the value of the environment to all economic activity. And it is critical to understand that there is no conflict between properly valuing the environment and ensuring that we have sustainable economic growth over the long term. Indeed, unless we safeguard the natural world and have fresher water, more abundant marine life, cleaner air, more carbon sinks, and resilient and diverse sources of food production, then our prospects for growth in the future don't just grow dimmer, human progress itself risks going backwards. And that is why fostering innovation and facilitating creativity in our economy matters so much. Because whether it's a more sophisticated waste treatment, or more thoughtful cultivation and breeding of crops, improved animal husbandry facilitated by digital technology and machine learning, or the precision application of chemical inputs, whether it's virtual agriculture, increasing yields and sparing land for wildlife, or new precision controls on fish catches. Innovation can ensure that we grow our natural capital and our wider economy at the same time. But even as we take the opportunity which Brexit provides to reshape support for our agriculture, to make it more productive and innovative, we must also remember that economic growth is always a means to an end, human flourishing. And our policy should also recognise values which can never be captured on any balance sheet. As we reform, we also need to keep rural communities healthy and resilient. We need to respect the value that people place on belonging alongside earning. We need to recognise the right to beauty in all our lives. I know Policy Exchange will be developing new ideas in these areas, and others, including looking at the critical question of how we can satisfy the need for additional housing in a way which not only contributes to improving natural capital, but also enhances the aesthetic quality of our towns and cities. But all that innovation, that improved productivity, depends, as the government has set out, on reforming capitalism anew to incentivise entrepreneurialism rather than rewarding rent-seeking. And that takes me to the other area where we need to invest more wisely to boost creativity: human capital. I began today by talking about education, and I want to conclude by saying just a little more about how we enhance human potential. We've made significant strides in recent years in improving education, but there's still so much more to do. Beginning in the very first months and years of life, we need to improve preschool learning and intervene when children are not being given the love, stability and nurture they need to develop cognitive ability and emotional resilience. And there is still far more to do to close the divide between the opportunities available to the most fortunate in society and the less favoured. While a more stretching national curriculum and more ambitious examinations have helped considerably, we still need to ensure that children from poor backgrounds have improved access to cultural capital, have more opportunities to learn the skills of oral argument and debate, have more opportunities to excel in musical, sporting or artistic competition, and more opportunities to take risks, push boundaries, challenge orthodoxies, speak freely and dare intellectually. These are all areas that my colleague Damien Hines is exploring, and I know he will be supported by Policy Exchange in looking at how education and social reform can go further, from the curriculum studied and its appropriateness for our times, to the institutional frameworks required to provide the very highest quality technical and vocational education. I know Policy Exchange will continue itself to push boundaries. And I also know that Policy Exchange will critically be involved in one of the most important areas of debate for our society when it comes to maximising human potential. And that is making sure that we all live in healthy communities where the quality of human relationships the attachments that we have to place and family, the pride that we take in the local and specific, are cherished and sustained. The politics of belonging and the nature of a modern inclusive patriotism will, I know, Dean, be one of your major areas of study. But let me enter one specific additional request. As we know, and as I touched on earlier, the great flowering of human creativity, economic growth, knowledge and innovation, which occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries, when modern capitalism was born and mankind was liberated from a bare subsistence existence, was the consequence of a revolution in ideas. In place of conformity, hierarchy and censorship came challenge, subversion and free thinking. Where before the Holy Inquisition had imposed strict obedience to dogma and quiescence before established opinion, now a new spirit of questioning and daring took over, from Spinoza to Locke, Mandeville to Newton, the Levellers to the Royal Society. In all of these cases, new thinking sought to challenge the comfortable assumptions of received wisdom. If we are now to meet the challenges of our time, then we need to revive and support that culture of dissent and daring that I have described. We need more questioning and experimentation, more innovation and challenge. But I fear the culture of our times does not welcome dissent and challenge as it should. Speakers are denied platforms at our universities. Texts and thoughts which might trigger or unsettle are deprecated or denied a hearing. Social media squadrons police and punish unconventional thinking. Original thinking is scrutinized for political acceptability, and if it is deemed to fall outside prescribed boundaries, the author is attacked, often with efforts to deny the individual professional standing. The human spirit cannot soar when these traps and shackles are deployed so energetically to limit freedom of thought and speech. Capitalism, the means by which we generate not just economic growth, but the prosperity which allows us all the chance to live in abundance, depends on, historically as I've described, and now as I have argued, the freedom to dare and differ. Ultimately, that freedom is the good which needs the most careful thought, support and investment in to secure our future, to deliver this government's mission of a capitalism which works for everyone. Which is why, Dean, I wish you and the team at Policy Exchange, the home of free thinking, every success in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I can ask our distinguished panellists to, in order to accommodate time for questions, to keep their remarks to 5 minutes. Delighted to welcome Paul Marshall, first time onto our platform. If you want to do it from a sedentary, or do you want to do it from a standing? What's sedentary? Okay.
Sedentary.
Yeah.
So that was a typically generous and high-minded and erudite speech, and I agreed with every word except for the reference to founder shares and voting on founder shares. But it's a rather small difference. It's also typical of Michael to assemble 4 speakers from completely different political persuasion to respond to him, and I suspect we will all find very positive things to say. So that is, and well done to Dean for making this happen. I would like to lower the tone, basically, which is, because I agree with everything Michael said, I want to focus just on the obstacles to Michael's vision in terms of how difficult is this just me, or is this how difficult it is to make it happen. The first obstacle is the strength of crony capitalism. It is very strong. The returns on capital from lobbying, to use a couple of live examples, from having the right Heathrow scheme or the right approach to water utility regulation, go into the hundreds of millions of pounds for the beneficiaries and the incumbents. So the amount you spend, the 1.7 billion in Brussels, it's over 2 billion in Washington, D.C., that's a very small down payment. And I could confidently predict that that number will actually just continue to rise very strongly unless something is done. So crony capitalism is very strong. Davos is the kind of temple of crony capitalism. It unites bankers, central bankers, big business, politicians, and even journalists, who mostly journalists love to Lionel Barber loves to go to Davos. The capture is very well advanced. The soft left, Blair, Clinton, Schroeder, Mandelson, they love this world. The soft right is also fairly well captured. And of course the issue is it's quite natural that companies invest in this, and companies and banks, it's in their interest to make this happen. The people who have to resist are the politicians. They have to have actually remarkable discipline to resist the blandishments of lobbyists. And Michael very kindly, he mentioned Greg Clark, who I also have a lot of personal esteem for, but if you look at the corporate governance progress of that paper, between the green paper and the white paper, it's almost been completely neutered from the quite strong recommendations in the green paper. Why has that happened? I don't know the details, but basically a lot of resistance has come from Treasury, from number 10, and presumably that there were revolving doors of certain people coming into the Treasury number 10 who basically massively watered down the ambition of that reform. Likewise, if you look at the Brexit process, from my perspective, the issue about managing the extrication from Europe presents a lot of threats to incumbents. They know exactly how to play the game, and they quite rightly, to some degree, spend a lot of time warning about all the dangers. But is anybody consulting James Dyson or Jim Ratcliffe about the opportunities? Well, even if they did, probably James Dyson and Jim Ratcliffe haven't got the time to go and spend a lot of time, because that's just not how they operate. They're interested in opportunities for wider free trade, but they'll just get on with it. They're not going to be going around the revolving door into the Treasury. So I think that one of the first things we need to do as soon as Brexit is done is have a lobbying bill in this country so that we do not replicate what's happened in Brussels and Washington, D.C. That's the first obstacle, is the strength of crony capitalism. The second obstacle is market fundamentalism. And there is a genuine strand of political thought which is represented by at least 2 think tanks in this country, I would say, and it's very strong in the Republican Party in the United States, that actually has a view that markets are the best way of allocating resources. They probably are. But the way to phrase that is much more modestly. The markets are the least bad way of allocating resources. And the ideological approach to markets is basically coming from people who've learned about it in textbooks. Anybody who works in markets knows that they're just full of failure, and that there is scope, and it's actually vital for governments to intervene. And so as you try to reform it, you, Michael, and others will have to resist the pressures from market fundamentalists. And that will be difficult, I think, personally, within the Conservative Party, because Labour have occupied this territory of being steadfast critiques of capitalism. And if you seem to support that criticism, some people will regard that as betraying the cause. But actually, that's the wrong approach, because Labour's critique of capitalism in many ways is absolutely right. QE and this distortion of asset prices, the problems with privatized monopolies, the problem with corporate governance, the problem with the chronic underinvestment, private sector underinvestment as well as public in this country. All of those criticisms are right. The problem is that Labour's prognosis is it would be a disaster. But what we have to do is accept a lot of the basis of the criticism which Michael set out in his speech, and get on with the fact that capitalism needs reform, as it does, as Michael says, every generation. And Schumpeter understood this better than anybody else 150 years ago. Capitalism just needs to constantly reform and renew. And the third obstacle is what you might call the snakes and ladders problem, which is that, yes, capitalism is not a zero-sum game. It does lift most boats, but it doesn't lift all boats. And if you have entrepreneurial capitalism in a time of disruption, huge disruption, there are going to be losers as well as winners. And it will be, I think, difficult. The Conservative Party is the home of the establishment of this country, and it's natural that people move to the Conservative Party and they expect it to conserve, to preserve, and that includes preserving certain privileges. And if you take one example, which won't be necessarily popular in the room, but I just put it out there, which is inheritance tax. Inheritance tax, there are 37% of estates in this country are qualified to pay inheritance tax. Only 6% of them pay it. And that's because over the years, the rentier class have found many ways to persuade the Treasury to introduce ways of avoiding inheritance tax, and Juliet's newspaper advertises them most Sundays. And they're perfectly legal, and most people do it. And the large estates, the rich estates, just don't pay inheritance tax. And it's only actually the people just on the margin who do. And so and if you try to raise that debate, I suspect that will be an extremely difficult and unpopular set of issues to navigate. And that just is another demonstration of why these issues can actually be much more difficult than they seem in Michael's speech. And that's why I think it's a wonderful initiative that you're taking, Dean, in taking this forward, and because it's in think tanks that the real thinking needs to be done before it can be presented to government.
Thank you. Ruth Davis, welcome for the first time.
Thank you very much. A great pleasure to be here and to hear that extraordinary speech. I think one of the things that we've valued very greatly in the environment movement in Michael becoming Secretary of State is the intellectual energy that he brings to this debate. We have very different views, I think, on the panel about all sorts of things, about Brexit, about our party politics. But one thing I think we can probably agree on is that the worst of politics is when it's moribund. The worst of politics is when people don't actually engage in the meat of intellectual debate. And Michael has not just galvanised his department, but to a certain extent, I think he's also galvanised the environment movement to become a much, much more vibrant place, full of ideas, full of conflict, actually, but conflict in a way that I think is probably hugely creative. Yep. The two things that really kind of emerged from Michael's speech in terms of our kind of relationship with the natural environment that mattered most to me in a way were one, that he's able to put our relationship with the natural world where it belongs, at the centre of our sense of identity and belonging, to relate that to human relationships and flourishing, and relate that to place. And the second thing that I think he's done that is of huge value to us is that he's recaptured our learning and understanding from the natural sciences, which is a vitally important tradition, part of our Enlightenment tradition, that enables us to understand fundamentally the dependence of the economy on the environment. This is not a hippie game. This is something that is actually fundamentally founded on an understanding of biology and the natural sciences. It is intellectually rigorous, and it's essential that we understand that in order to be able to pursue a future project that is actually a kind of foundational investment in human prosperity. Now, those two things are extraordinary and remarkable things, and we value them greatly. I do think, though, that I have to put a challenge to policy exchange and a challenge to the Conservative Party and the Conservative movement as a whole as to whether or not actually Michael's insights are things that can be embedded for the long term. I come from a movement and a background where I've watched flirtations from the Conservative Party and the Conservative movement with greenery, if you like. I've watched those flirtations before. And they've been followed by a certain level of unfaithfulness, let us say.
Were they ever consummated?
Well, indeed, it's a good question. Yeah. So I am really trying to understand, as I think many people will be, whether this is another kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink moment and a little bit of, kind of how's your father around the back of the bike sheds, yeah. Or whether actually this is a proposal of marriage. And the answer to that question, I think, is not necessarily entirely in Michael's hands, though I possibly wish that it was.
Civil partnership.
Indeed. It may be that the answer lies partly with policy exchange, but partly with the wider Conservative movement. I will remind you of the moment of Hug a Husky, followed by the moment of let's ditch this green crap. And I'd like to remind you as well, actually, of the cost that involved to a sense of trust amongst at least 6 million people, almost a tenth of the population of this country in one way or another are members of, supporters of, or associated with organisations that look after, protect the environment and look after the natural world. That's 6 million people, and in fact very many more will have an understandable sense of scepticism about this particular engagement with environmental politics, because they will remember the last time this happened, and they will approach this with a certain level of doubt and trepidation. There's a political risk in flirting with this stuff. There's also a political risk, actually, and a huge economic risk in giving a signal to those who would potentially invest in the green economy that this isn't for real. I recommend all of you have a look at the latest FTSE analysis of the now size of the global green economy. $4 trillion, a sixth of global economic activity, now at the same level as investments in the fossil fuel sector. That is the thing that you are risking when you flirt with this agenda and then pull back from it. It is bad for politics, but it's also fundamentally bad for the economy and prosperity of the country. So what do we need to do to overcome that? Michael's put forward propositions around the building of new laws and institutions which could actually turn this into a durable marriage. And it is laws, institution, cultural change, foundational institutional stuff that fundamentally makes change in politics. It's not necessarily policy initiatives or announcements. And I think we have to see whether or not the government as a whole is prepared to follow through on that. One of the actually biggest cross-party achievements in the country over the course of the last 15 or 20 years is the building of the Climate Change Act. You know, it has its fans, its detractors. If you move outside of the UK and look at that piece of legislation, what you will see is a country committed over the long term in a cross-party way to setting a clear regulatory framework which makes it possible to feel as if they can in future invest in that environment, and is a massive signal about commitment. We need something similar to that around the natural environment. So that's my first challenge. My second challenge, I think, is that Michael is instigating a set of reforms to agricultural policy in this country which have the potential to make a profound change to how we manage land, but actually to the culture and nature of who we are as a country. We've heard about the risks of a kind of let-it-rip free market approach, which isn't underpinned with an understanding and relationship around place and around human flourishing. I am a passionate advocate for agricultural reform. We're in a situation at the moment where large quantities of public money are transferred into the hands of some of the richest people in the country, and actually that money is paid out in a way which doesn't necessarily deliver any kind of public goods and doesn't deliver for us what we need in terms of both protecting human communities but also the restoration of nature. But the process of that reform has to be done in a way that invests in the people of rural Britain, invests in our agriculture sector, builds institutions that are capable of giving them the skills they need to compete globally, that recognises that using tools of the kind that Michael was talking about, local procurement policy, local lending, is the way in which to approach a fundamental reform of a system like that that doesn't actually leave the heart ripped out of communities, that doesn't fundamentally ignore and despise traditions and human relationships. Yep. So the second thing that we have to do is embark on this huge reform in the countryside and the renewal of nature in a way that is deeply, deeply sensitive to who we are as a country and sensitive to our people. And I think that's an amazing mission that we share, and I hope that Policy Exchange can help us do that in that very particular way. Thanks very much.
1 second. Sorry, we're very. Excuse me. We're sorry, Morris.
Yeah.
Running behind time.
I'm always running behind time, and I think that's well. First of all, thank you, Dean and Michael, and to see publicly there's been a long conversation around this developing over time. So it's excellent to be here. So I just want to raise a few things about the speech and the way that feeds in to what Ruth just said about the need to make this relationship work in a faithful way. The first is about conservatism. And in the bits about in nature in your speech, there was a sense of place and a sense of nurturing. But in the stuff about the economy, I mean, it was very interesting that you said about Labour that the party of Attlee, Wilson, Callaghan and Brown, as if Tony Blair really wasn't part of this story. And the reason being is that stuff about that you talk about innovation, creativity, the maximisation of human potential was straight out of New Labour and nowhere near conservative enough is the strange thing that I'm saying to you. And how do you nurture and renew and revive and almost resurrect old institutions that now have a place in the new consensus around place, around counties, around vocation, as well as around banking, which you said so clearly. And in a way that leads to the language. So what I would challenge you on is this thing about capital, natural capital, human capital, environmental capital, reproduces the Blairite problems of modernisation. And the problem with modernisation theory is it really has no place for tradition. And it really has no place for what you're talking about, which is embedded and embodied people living in some form of moral relationship with each other in society. And so let's just talk about that for a moment, because I think it's important. So I would replace, if you replace the word capital with the word inheritance, and I'll take your point, but if you talk about a natural inheritance or a civic inheritance or inheritance of knowledge, which is what you're talking about, the problem with capital is you've always got to maximise the returns in the shortest possible time. And that's wrong. With an inheritance, we know from our everyday language, there's two things you can do with it. You can either nurture it or squander it. And the squandering of the inheritance is a fundamental thing that conservatism can stand for here, in terms of still holding to the idea of a person as a social being, whose meaning is given by love, relationships, attachment and belonging, and not necessarily the maximisation of their career opportunities through a life. So I would definitely urge that if we consider nature, for example, as a natural capital, then the question is always, what do we do with it? Not how do we live with it in relation. And the same with human beings, because what you're flirting with, to use Ruth's brilliant analogy, is a fundamental critique of capitalism based on the commodification of human beings, nature, and money. And in order to domesticate that relentless urge to maximise the return and to somehow get capitalism, which is very alien to capitalism, to be faithful, it's always looking for younger partners with greater returns on investment, as Paul is very well aware. The domestication of capital is the fundamental civilisational task. And that involves, I think, moving away from Blair New Labour managerialism towards what you talk about, which is the institutional ecology. So the great thing in the paper is, which you link to freedom of speech, is that without a diverse institutional ecology, you can't cope with challenge. You don't have the resources to bring to bear. So I think that's really an important part of it. And then that leads to the kind of, oh, by the way, just as a historical thing, capitalism never bought water. Water has never been, because water is not a commodity, and yet, so it's always been a municipal activity, and always best done. It's a very interesting story in relation to water. But just to end, because I know Dean's looking at me in that way, you know, and I always resist it. It's strange. I always slow down at that moment, Dean. So. I don't know what that's about. It must. So I'll make 2 points then. The first is, don't be too horrible about populism. Populism in America in the 1890s was about the small rather than the big. It was about the homestead, about defending the small farm, about human scale, and it was in fact progressivism that made it all upscale. Big projects, big Keynesian brains doing big. And so in that way, populism is a defence of the small and the things that Ruth was talking about. But the second one is, you put as the opposition between entrepreneurialism. It's always my favourite George Bush joke when he said, the French have no word for entrepreneur. And it's the opposition between entrepreneurialism and rent-seeking, where I think it's actually between vice and virtue. Because in what you're putting on the head of the entrepreneur here is way beyond what we mean by that. You're looking for courage, you're looking for purpose, you're looking for long-term faithful commitments to future generations. And when you're talking about rentier, you're talking about greed, you're talking about vice, you're talking about self-regard. So in a way, you've got to open into a wider ethical, in this new consensus that you're talking about, it's going to be virtue versus vice, and that's where the populism comes in terms of how we do the politics. So to conclude, Dean, just to say, really, this is fantastic work and extremely interesting, and I think this move towards the politics that's hinted at here is the greatest thing that is coming from the Brexit moment, because we actually can make these changes and do these things without the constraints of external directives.
Thank you, Maurice. Julia.
I'd like to start by saying that I'm very happy to hear a speech from a Conservative that addresses the world we live in now rather than the world we lived in 40 years ago. Because too often at the moment, when people talk about what needs to be done with capitalism, Tory economic debates seem to talk about the threat of unions, the need for privatization and communism, which are all problems of the past. Whereas what Michael was talking about and what we're dealing with now are today's problems, which are stagnant wages, low investment, high debt, and low savings. And these are problems across the developed world, but they're particularly bad in Britain, despite the fact that we have lower corporation tax and that we're one of the best places in the world to start a business. So we've heard politicians start to talk a lot about productivity. But what I find slightly odd about the way we're talking about productivity is that we've started to talk about it as a cause, as a prime mover, instead of as a symptom of a well-managed economy. And we heard that just now. Philip Hammond does it, the opposition does it. In fact, productivity is what happens when companies have the right incentives to invest. It's not something that we can drive up by sort of pre-imagining what companies should do. So the question is, how do you create the conditions in which companies want to invest rather than sort of doing the cycle of taking money out or that Michael described? And I don't think actually that the solution to this is going to come from corporate governance reviews. We've had lots of corporate governance reviews over the years, and they never really result in much change. And I think it's very easy to blame a sort of class of executive managers and to say it's all them. CEOs are really easy to hate. They get up too early and they work too hard and they think they know everything.
They pay themselves too much. I think that's the issue.
And their committees pay them too much. But I don't think that corporate governance reviews are going to solve that problem. But I do think that talking about the misallocation of capital is right. And the question is, why is capital going to the wrong place? And I will briefly whip through a few things that I think could solve this. Firstly, there's the tax system. We don't gains on land and property are the most lightly taxed things. Debt interest is offset against tax, whereas income and risk-taking equity investment are much more heavily taxed. We need people to save, and yet we tax making money instead of spending it. Instead of corporation tax and business rates, we should start taxing the massive gains made on unproductive investments, which are land and property and consumption more. Secondly, We need to encourage companies to invest in labour rather than relying on reams of cheap labour. And this should be one of the aims at the heart of our immigration policy. It's fine to let in lots of highly skilled workers whom we need, but we actively need to restrict the supply of low-paid workers because actually high wages don't come from productivity. High wages are a reason that companies invest in productivity to defray their costs. Thirdly, we need to encourage, we need to turn the cycle in terms of a massive reallocation of capital that is caused by low interest rates. Because every time we've hit a bump in the road, we simply reinflate the debt bubble and go down further into low interest rates until we've now hit rock bottom and there's nowhere we can go. And one of the reasons that capital isn't being moved into productive investments is because it's tied up with zombie firms who can't afford to invest and simply service the interest on their debt because it's so low. And fourthly, we need to build more stuff. We need to build houses, power plants, recycling plants, train lines, roads, airports, ships. To do this, either the government has to deregulate and let the private sector build, or the government has to build and then privatize in order to not get into too much debt. And there would be a lot of pension funds who are willing buyers. So. But to go back to where Paul started, which is these reforms will not be easy. They all create winners and losers, and it's very easy to talk about reform, but it's much harder to deliver it. And we have a government now that, or Conservatives in government, it's taken 9 years for them to even make a decision on Heathrow. They've totally failed to take on vested interests in NIMBYism or the way that our system distributes to the older generation and not to the younger. And so the question to me is the political class really up to this?
Thank you. Got just a few minutes for questions. If I can just get a sense of how many people. I'm sorry if I'll disappoint anyone. Gentleman there by the camera. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
If you can give your name and organisation, please.
Ben Wright from the Thank you, Ben Wright from the BBC. It's a question for Mr. Gove, if I may. You've been talking about the future of British capitalism and the future of Brexit, and the two are clearly intertwined. The government has delayed the publication of its Brexit white paper. Is that further proof of a deep stalemate within the cabinet about the sort of shape of the future trade relationship it wants with the EU? When are we going to get it? And are cabinet tensions boiling over? And if I may, Labour have said that they want to keep the UK as close to the single market as possible after Brexit. Would you vote with Labour on that next week?
I don't think I will be voting with Labour next week. I can give you a pretty clear answer to that. On the publication of the white paper, we're working collaboratively across government in order to ensure that we have a comprehensive vision of Britain flourishing outside the European Union, and that will be published shortly. But of course, the timing of that is dependent on making sure that we get every single part of that prospectus right, and I'll be working on that today and tomorrow with my colleagues in order to make sure that we have a comprehensive and persuasive account of how we can succeed outside the EU.
Gentleman in the middle row, behind you, further down. Yeah. Name and organisation, please.
John McTernan, Momentum. Historically, it's been the Labour movement and Social Democrats who've reformed capitalism to make it safe for itself and for the country. Does that mean that you've become a Social Democrat, or have I become a Conservative?
Is that a question for all the panellists?
I think I tried as much as I could in the speech not to get involved in too much party. I mean, obviously I'm proud of what the government has achieved and hopeful about what we will achieve, but I didn't want to get involved in too much party politics. But I do think one of the challenges that we face, and we face it not just in Britain but across the Western world, is that the traditional position of the social democratic left is weaker now than it has been for generations. And so therefore, the capacity of a party of the centre-left to reform capitalism rather than wreck it is less now, I think. And I don't want to indulge in partisan bashing and all the rest of it. But I think, therefore, there is an opportunity for parties like the Conservative Party, which are parties which are a broad coalition, to be able to co-opt thinking from outside its traditional roots in order to do the work that I sought to describe. And one of the things that I would say is that it's a tribute to Dean and to Policy Exchange that in gathering this panel here, you had, I thought, and you could, I hope, tell from my scribbling, very good ideas about how we could realise some of the questions which I deliberately left open in the speech about what we need to do.
Anyone else want to say anything on the panel in response?
I would say briefly that I think the association of conservatism with very red-blooded capitalism is really a Thatcherite thing, and actually the party's tradition before that is much more diverse.
Two more questions, if I may. Lady at the back, and then gentleman third row from the front.
Anne Perkins from The Guardian. In next week's consideration of the Lord's amendments to the withdrawal bill, there's one inviting the government to support strengthening your proposals, Mr. Gove, on your environmental protection consultation document, and I wonder if you were minded to accept that amendment.
Can I just one more question? So we'll take them as a break.
Yeah, of course.
Gentleman there. Yep, up towards the...
Steve Hawks, the Sun. I just wondered, you've expressed before your
Sorry,
disappointment...
can't hear if you just start again, sorry.
Steve Hawks at The Sun. You've expressed some disappointment before about the lack of no-deal planning. I wondered, Ian Duncan Smith was on the radio this morning suggesting that if the EU isn't willing to talk trade at this month's council, we should just push ahead with no deal. What would your comment be on that? And secondly, are you going in your speech as far as saying the Conservative government should consider pay controls at the executive level or pay curbs, or are you just suggesting naming and shaming? You talk about regulators and the water industry. Is it time for the Conservative government to revisit all privatisations given the failures in rail, energy, etc.?
A point from Anne, it's certainly the case that the Lords gave us a pretty clear message to take a particular direction in response to a consultation on environmental principles and governance. I think it will be the case, but I don't want to anticipate things, that there may well be a response, an amendment in lieu, which seeks to address some of those concerns, but also provide a more constructive way forward, because I think that the Lord's Amendment, while I know the honourable intentions of those who put it forward, wasn't quite the answer to the challenge that we face, if I can put it that way. And on Steve's point, I think we need to, and government is, planning for all eventualities, but we want to secure, and I believe that we will secure, a good deal with the European Union, that the future economic partnership that we will secure will be in our interest and in the EU 27's interests. But of course, work goes on within government to prepare for all eventualities, and Ian is right to urge us to maintain a pace and focus in that work. But I also think that what we want to do is to make sure that we use the implementation period that the Prime Minister has secured in order to prepare for life post-2020 in a way that maximises benefits for all the people in this country, and also means that we maintain close economic and other ties with our friends and partners in Europe. And on the question of action that we need to take, in my own area, I've outlined to water companies some of the changes that need to be made, and the regulator Johnson Cox is taking appropriate steps, because it was the case that water companies had corporate structures that were designed in a way which favoured the investors rather than citizens, and that change is coming.
My most cynical, jaded, hard-bitten colleague in this office has texted me during the course of this saying that that was the best blooming panel event we've ever had, and that kind of thing. She, that's the hint, didn't use the word blooming, by the way, but anyhow, that's just to spare your blushes on a family occasion such as this. But anyhow, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. Absolutely brilliant performance. Please join me.
Thank you very much.